I talk to a lot of practice owners who wanted the magic bullet. Give me the script. Give me the copy that I got to put on the landing page. Give me the script that my office manager is going to use to call these patients that's going to get them to show up. You know, Jerry Durham, like arrive, pay, and stay. Even Jerry talks about this. He has, I think, a framework. I think he calls it a checklist. I call it a framework. But they're basically, if you line them up, they're probably very similar. And the idea is not that you're running through this rigid if-then statement thing, a script almost. That sounds really difficult. I'm hoping that we can make you better type thing. It should be more of a conversation, and it should be really person-centered.
Kick it.
Strata Stories. My name is Thomas Schreiber, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Strata PT. Strata PT is a single EMR platform and revenue cycle management service for physical, occupational, and speech therapy practices that helps you achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate. On today's episode, Paul Singh, the CEO of Strata PT, talks with Rafi Salazar, a PT and the CEO of Proactive Rehab and Wellness. Paul and Rafi talk through the power of mindset when building your clinic, the importance of working on the right projects, challenging invisible scripts, and lastly, why taking time off is key to success. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and RCM works, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo. Now, without further delay, here's today's episode.
I think it was Anthony Maritata or Tony posted, it was like a poll on LinkedIn. He was like, you know, PTs spend, I don't know, 6 figures on their, basically to buy themselves a job, right, to get the degree. But when it comes down to it, they're either unwilling or unable, seemingly unwilling or unable to get funding for the business. You know, they're either really averse to getting a loan, or they don't want to get a loan, or they just, for some reason, they're not to start a business. And some of the stuff in the comments that people were saying either on Facebook or on LinkedIn was like, there were underlying reasons for that. Maybe it was the economy is the way it was, and 7 point whatever % for a loan is crazy, and like the math doesn't make sense. Some people were saying they're already coming into the profession with a ton of debt. Like, why would they take on more if there's a risk of failure? So I was like, well, like a ancillary to that then is like, let's have a discussion around how can clinicians generate revenue, start a business that's going to work for them, that's going to replace their clinical income, that doesn't require them to take a loan out. Like if the loan is the big, or the funding is the big barrier to clinicians becoming entrepreneurs, what can we do that doesn't involve getting either a loan or capital? You talk about like venture capital. I know you're in this space, but most clinicians, VC is something they've, maybe heard in context of like VCR back in the 1990s. Like they're not thinking,
right.
They're not thinking like big giant exits where you're turning something really quickly, or that's just totally off the table for a lot of clinicians. They got into it because they want to care for people, right? I'm a big proponent. Somebody said on the podcast a while back, like the people that went into healthcare for one of two reasons, and usually both. The first reason is there's like a vocational aspect. They feel like this is the way that they're going to serve the greater humanity and society, and this is their calling, right? And you see this even in the greater landscape of physical therapy. Larry Benz wrote a book called To Care, and it was all about that, right? Like we as clinicians are called to care. But the other reason that people go into healthcare, which probably doesn't get talked about as much, but it's probably more intuitive than people would like really think about, is that we're told growing up, like there's always going to be sick people. You're always going to have a job. If you have a set of skills, like doctors aren't unemployed, PTs aren't unemployed, you can usually get a safe, secure, stable career field in PT or in healthcare. And that kind of just pulls back some of that. It attracts people that are more risk averse, right? So the idea of the constraint-based game was like, okay, that's the context you're dealing with. People that for some reason or another, you can argue about whether or not it makes sense mathematically, whether there's a lot of upside to get funding to start a venture. They're not going to do that, right? So what can we do outside of that that's going to generate revenue? And that's kind of what started that. And I came up with a few ideas. I know some people were talking about like being a fractional CMO and stuff like that. I don't know how viable that is, but like there are options out there. I was like, And it was not even in the right industry. It was like fractional CMO for like, I think industrial or manufacturing. I was like, yeah, because that's going to really leverage the PT skills. But I get where they're going. I do have a buddy that's doing fractional CMO stuff for startups, and he's making a killing. It's awesome. So it's possible. But yeah, that was the idea.
Yeah, and I think your point about, not getting into further debt is an important one. I think, you sort of alluded to it, like the other hat I wear is in venture capital, and I do a lot of investing and stuff like that. And sort of the unfortunate truth that I try to share with a lot of people is that money doesn't unfortunately change the outcome for most businesses. In fact, it only accelerates what's already going to happen. So I think there's this whole trope of like, gosh, if I only had money, I'd be able to start my business, start my practice, whatever. And before I get piled on by the internet, police or whatever, of course there are scenarios and economic situations where you do need some money, and all that. But the point I think you're trying to make is correct, that like, it doesn't make sense to start a new venture by getting into more debt, and
oftentimes money is like and cash flow sometimes, even like cash flow is great. You want a strong cash flowing business, but oftentimes what you'll discover is that money it covers up real operational issues in the business because you don't have to worry about it, right? If you got 50, 60, $70,000 in the bank and you're inefficient by 1 or 2%, it doesn't matter because you don't care. You're getting paid, your team is getting paid. So there is some benefit in kind of like taking a look at the business, maybe in the business model as a whole, and saying, okay, if I had $0 and I had to start this without any of my line of credit or funding or what I've got in the bank, like how do we make it work? And I think most practices and practice owners, if they really look under the hood, they can't do that.
The thing about it is like everybody kind of wants to believe in the overnight success. They watch Shark Tank or whatever, and they see these very wealthy people, and they're like in their mind, everything is like, oh my gosh, they had to get one thing right. And it's sort of what's happened is there's this like perpetuated myth that like if you're in the right room with the right person at the right time, then magically money appears, and then magically you become a millionaire as well. And I can tell you, at least in my experience, and I'd be curious if it matches anything you've seen, most businesses didn't start out most business owners that I meet, venture funded or not, didn't like risk everything to start it. They didn't like jump on the proverbial table, kick the proverbial stapler and say, screw the man, I'm starting a business. They didn't do that. They tested it. Like the best entrepreneurs are risk averse, not risk tolerant. They're de-risking the business the whole way. So I don't know if that's been your experience or not, but I have never really met anybody that risked it all and mortgaged their kids, future, hoping that it would work. Yeah.
I think many of them do. I can't even remember the guy that wrote. Maybe it was Peter Sims wrote the book, Little Bets or Tiny Bets, and the whole concept was like successful businesses aren't betting the farm. They're doing a lot of tiny little experiments in which everyone works. Right. They're killing the others and backing a truck of money up to it.
That's exactly right. It's funny you mentioned Peter Sims because a lot of my investing strategy was based off of some of the ideas in his book. My entire, actually, I would tell you my entire investing strategy was built off the back of Peter Sims' book, Little Bets, and then Moneyball, that old book from the 80s with baseball betting in it. But anyway, I love your point on this, and I think we'll put a link to that particular post on there because I think it's like it's just so important to start talking about this more and more because I don't know about you, I hear from potential practice owners, people that are like, gosh, I want to start something. And they inevitably mention cash as the limiting factor. And it's like, whoa, hang on. Even if anyway, I don't want to redo it.
I like telling my kids, I don't have old kids that are doing this yet, but like my oldest is 9 and we're having conversation. I'm like, son, we live in a world where if you've got some kind of knowledge or expertise and you have an internet connection, the world is basically your oyster, right? Like there's no reason that you can't, like money shouldn't be a limiting factor because everything's so cheap. I mean, we're using Riverside to record this. Like back in 2010, you would have needed a TriCaster and $20,000 worth of equipment and all. Like, we're just in a place where things are getting so cheap and free, you know, like it's awesome.
You mentioned VCR earlier, which is going to date both you and me here. But the funny thing is, like, I was thinking about this the other day. You know, my kids are pretty young, and your kids are relatively young too. And I was just thinking, like, they have access to everything they ever wanted. In exchange, or in the difference is, like, when I was growing up in the '80s and stuff like that. I remember that, like, if one kid in your neighborhood had the Encyclopedia Britannica, you were like, you had it all. Like, that was the thing, because you could go find any answer you wanted. And like, my 4-year-old, almost 5-year-old yesterday, like after school, was like, what's the world made of? And I like just went to Google and searched for a kid's video on YouTube for like how molecules work, you know? So yeah, I mean, access to information is just out there. Maybe here's the more blunt way to put it, and I might lose some listeners on this one, but you remember when you and I were growing up, like your teacher would be like, hey, listen, there's no dumb questions, Rafi. And, you know, if you're thinking it, somebody else is thinking it. All right. Here's the message to anybody listening. It's 2024 while we're recording this. There are dumb questions now. Like 99% of what you need to know to start a practice is Googleable.
Is there.
It's probably free on YouTube. Right. Exactly. So, anyway,
it's funny though. Like, I wonder how much of that, just like having the availability of information has made people just not want to think, or maybe it just empowers limiting beliefs. I don't know. But like, even teaching at the university when I was in the grad program, the number of students that would ask me a question that was literally buried in an email or a Google search away was like crazy to me. I'm like, listen, we're both adults and you have a smartphone in your pocket. We should not be having this conversation.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I don't lose too many listeners on that one. So let's maybe jump to another thing you posted. Now this one's a little bit older, but it was a story you wrote, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes here, but it was you wrote a post on LinkedIn, and it was about your care coordinator and a conversation you overheard. And just to kind of fast track it, at the end of that post, you said, like, hey, there's a lot to learn from this interaction, but the 2 key points are, number one, taking time to be inefficient with a prospective patient can be the key to getting them to show up to their appointment, become engaged, and all that. And then the second point is that it doesn't matter what your website and your marketing materials say if it's not backed up by action. All the flowery language about a person-centric approach falls flat if the patient gets run through a checklist on the phone. I think that's super interesting, because I think, you know, and you know better than me, but I think that the margins on running a practice should be pretty good, except when you kind of like get sliced by 1,000 little cuts, and it usually happens somewhere in your front desk experience. So let's talk about that. What was do you remember the context on that particular post?
Yeah, well, more or less. So my care coordinator is funny. She was actually used to be a parole officer, so she comes from law enforcement. This is like her second career.
What?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Placeholder. We're doing a show on that later.
Yeah. Well, you know, a while back, I did a podcast. This is like 2 years ago, about the guys. I can't remember. His name is Dr. Neil. I think he's an optometrist, and he was talking about building your team. Like, he's got a software, and it's all HR management and recruiting. So the whole show is about like recruiting for the right fit. And it was kind of like the Jim Collins idea of like, you get the people on the bus and then you figure out where they're going to sit type thing. And I needed a front desk coordinator, a care coordinator, and my assistant in another business said, "I know somebody." One thing led to another. Stephanie ended up interviewing with us, and she was awesome. She fit right in. And she was like, "I don't know anything." I was like, "That's fine. We'll figure that out. You know, anybody can learn this. We just need the right person on the bus." So that's a great little story. We'll talk about that later. But anyways, so she, at the time that she was starting with us, was actually a PT patient in another clinic. And you don't have to be around me for a while to know that the way that I think about PT is a little different. I'm a little bit, I'm not one of those places running like a big chain, right? So a lot of the way I talk about person-centered care and like operationalizing patient engagement and person-centered care is different. And so she was kind of like quasi finishing up and kind of getting discharged from that PT while she was watching the way I was training our staff here, but like the stuff I was having her do when she was bringing in patients. And I think it made an impression on her. Obviously she's stuck with us for a while. She's awesome. But she was having a conversation with the patient, and this is not uncommon. Like, I feel like I could probably point to a couple examples of this is happening a couple times a week, maybe more than that, where she's on the phone and she's like, "Oh, this one time I used to have PT too, and it was a different place, and this is how it was different than what we do now, or what we do here," which I think is super, super important. But the point of what I was trying to make with that story is that I talked to a lot of, at least back when I was consulting exclusively with practice owners, I talked to a lot of practice owners who wanted like the magic bullet. Give me the script. Give me the copy that I got to put on the landing page. Give me the script that my office manager is going to use to call these patients, or my care coordinator is going to use to call these patients. That's going to get them to show up. You know, Jerry Durham, like arrive, pay, and stay. And even Jerry talks about this. Like, he has, I think, a framework. I think he calls it a checklist. I call it a framework, but they're basically, if you line them up, they're probably very similar.
Yep.
And the idea is not that you're running through this rigid if then statement thing where it's like this, like a script almost. That sounds really difficult. I'm hoping that we can make you better type thing. You know, like it should be more of a conversation, and it should be really person centered. At least that's the way we've really tried to push it. And a lot of practice owners think that they're going to get the copy on the website. It's going to drive a bunch of leads, or they're going to fix their ads. Ads is the big one too, right? It's going to drive a bunch of leads. And then I'm going to give my front desk this script, and it's going to rain money. And often that's not the case, right? Like, there's a whole lot of back end work that needs to be done. And really, almost a philosophical understanding isn't right. That maybe sounds too heady, but there's got to be a basic understanding of the reasons behind what you're asking and why you're asking it, or the way you're structuring these conversations for them to actually matter for patients.
I think, sorry, just not to connect it back to that first conversation, you were talking about that, and you know, your comment about like your care coordinator's previous role and stuff like that, it reminded me of my own sort of journey as well. I'm curious if you have some similar stories, but like, when I started my first business, like in hindsight, if you were to look at my businesses, they look very successful. Like, oh man, Paul got lucky or whatever. And maybe I did, but I bootstrapped my first business by selling cars at CarMax, right? Like that's how I did it, you know? And then even when I was starting my venture investing like 15 years ago, you know, it's easy to kind of look back and like, oh man, like you're investing, you must've had money. It's like, well, hang on. I got hammered in the 2008 crash just like everybody else.
Yeah.
But the way that we ended up bootstrapping that work was actually by building an events business, you know, that we eventually then rolled up underneath, you know, the investing. So it's like, okay, well, we'll put on conferences for entrepreneurs and use that to kind of like, you know, keep the bills paid while we figure out how to make it work. So I don't know if you had any similar stories while you were starting. I mean, even you alluded to the fact that when you were like consulting with other practices, like, and I think the key point there is really just to kind of keep hammering home to people that like, you didn't start with a bunch of cash. I didn't start with a bunch of cash to, you know.
I was a GS-11 employee for the federal government when I went on my own, which was, I think I was making $55K a year or something like that. You know, like median American income. But I think one of the big pieces, there's two things there. You alluded to one of it. Like, people think that you just got extremely lucky and that you're an overnight success. The other thing is like, and maybe this is different for you, but at least when I look back, like there was a series of life decisions that we made that, one, made it easy for us to make the jump when the opportunity presented itself, but we were looking for the opportunity. I think people confuse luck with positioning yourself to capitalize on an opportunity, right? If you're playing the victim, if you're thinking about how tough it is, or that you wish you had money to start a business, you're not going to see the opportunity that comes by that is one of these, you know, start it without any capital type thing.
Right.
It is very much a mindset game without getting like heady and like manifestation. Like,
oh yeah, we're not trying to be like anybody's.
There's
Tony
something
Robbins
to be said about
like
there's something to be said about, I'm looking for the opportunity. This is the opportunity. I've made decisions in my life that put me in a position to capitalize on this opportunity. And that maybe gives you a leg up on competition or somebody else that might not have been in that situation. But it's not some secret sauce. Like, it's not something that I have that nobody else has. I was intentional about something and it worked out for me, right? Like, it could have easily gone the other way and that business failed, and I would have been in a situation where, okay, going to start another job, going to build up some capital and then do it again, like,
Right.
it's just that mindset. I don't know if you're a fan of The Office, but there's an episode where Michael Scott like starts his own paper company. And they like go under and they're like, you have no money. And they're in there talking with the previous paper company about acquiring them. And and they're like, listen, you can't do this. And he's like, no, I have 100 names for paper companies. Like that idea, you just need to have it. Like if this one fails, I'm just going right back to the drawing board, right?
I admit that not everybody is listening to this trying to like find their next Tony Robbins. You and I are not trying to be somebody's like Tony Robbins here or anything like that. But
I don't have a deep enough voice.
Well, seriously, yeah, I'm not 17 feet tall like that guy. I also don't know how to price conferences near a airport at a hotel for $1 million a seat or something. But anyway, like, the interesting part here to me is that like that mindset is so important. I think that to me, a telltale sign that somebody is not in the right mindset is when they start to blame they. If they use the word they or words like that, what they're really doing is absolving themselves of the responsibility of figuring it out. And I think on the flip side of that coin, I think it's important to understand how success has changed over the years, and no matter how you define success, whether it's money, power, freedom, or something else entirely, the fact is that the nature of that success has changed quite a bit. Like when my parents were growing up and your parents were growing up, pensions were a real thing. If you put in the time and you put in the work, you would be able to retire at a reasonable age and hopefully have this pension that would let you live reasonably well for the rest of your life.
Get that gold watch of retirement for your 30 years of service and
right.
Good.
Now you and I, like, I don't know, I won't throw you under the bus. I'm 43. And the fact is, whatever generation I am, there are no pensions anymore. Unless you were military or government or something like that, there are no pensions anymore. And success to us is a function of the number of things you try. So to be very succinct about that, I think success for our parents' generation is really about hard work, sticking it out for the long term and that sort of thing. But to your point, I think success now is a function of the number of things you try. If I knew what the next LinkedIn or the next Facebook or the next, Twilio is going to be, I wouldn't invest 200 companies a year. I'd just invest in those.
Yeah, exactly.
But in a world where you can't predict the future, you really just have to kind of take this iterative approach to your career, to your business, to your life, and figure it out. So I don't know, there's something in it. And I might lose some people on this one. I grew up as a child of immigrants, and I totally get, immigration back in the day in the 80s, like that's a very risky thing. Like today, you and I can go on Google flights and, we're fortunate. So like, you can probably fly across the world for $1,000 a seat. I know that's not chump change, but it's certainly not as risky as it used to be because
it's not leaving your whole family behind, your livelihood, all of that. Yeah.
And in hindsight, I remember that like when my parents were raising us here, when they had moved here, like, there's this like old stereotype that Indian kids would go on to become doctors or lawyers or engineers, because I think in hindsight, the parents that had dropped everything to move across the planet did not want that same risk tolerance for their children. They wanted the perception of like higher education and all that. But to me,
one
of the formative,
go bad in the home country, like my dad.
Exactly.
My dad's dad had a business, lost it all just because of like the way property rights were down there, right? Like they kept the stocks for the businesses were like in a safety deposit box, and all it took was like one day his business partner signed a paper and he lost his whole business, So
oh man, yeah, don't get me even started on that topic. I always tell people it's like if you can't start a business in the United States, you can't start it anywhere. Like
anywhere, yeah.
Yeah, like you could
so it was
lose
just
everything.
Much more risky, at least for my parents. So like growing up,
totally.
One of the reasons I ended up in healthcare, right? Because obviously it was a safe, secure, stable job.
100%. I could bore you to death with stories of my extended family coming out of Uganda and places like that in Central Africa where they had to get bussed out under seat covers. But anyway, I think one of the most formative memories for me growing up was like, my parents were trying to tell me that if you went to school, you would have a higher chance of success and all that. But the thing I could never reconcile was that like, you would see like some guy own a bunch of liquor stores and have a $300,000 car. And in my mind, I think one of the formative sort of experiences was realizing that, hard work is not the differentiator. It's the ability to accept the iterative reality of what luck really is. And so, like, in other words, and this is going to be the part that I probably will hopefully don't get canceled on here, but like, if we just use money as a proxy for success, that is not the most important thing. Flexibility and all that is too. But if we just, for the sake of discussion, use money as the proxy of success, if you and I were to like sit on a random street corner and ask the person that drives the Toyota Corolla whether they think they work hard, and then we like stop the person that drives the Ferrari, $500,000 Ferrari, and ask them if they work hard, both of them will subjectively and objectively say yes, they believe they work hard. Generally speaking, what that tells us is that hard work is not the differentiator, it's the baseline. But the reality is that like one of them was able to get much more leverage by maybe working on bigger things or higher leverage things. Anyway, I know I could ramble about this.
Yeah,
but
no, I think that's such an important thing. Like I think you told me you were an early investor in the hustle. So you probably listened to the My First Million podcast.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Uh-huh. Yep.
Okay. So I can't remember if it was Sean Puri, if he was talking about this on their podcast or if he was being interviewed somewhere else. But he was talking about like the keys to success, like business success. And he said something along the lines of, it's not so much how hard you work. He said hard work is like number 5 in like if you were to prioritize what is going to make you successful. He said number 1 is working on the right project, right? Like if you're spending a lot of time on things that are going to yield little return, by just the math, you're going to earn less. You're going to be less successful than somebody who's spending maybe even half the time as you, but on a project that returns 10x, right? That's the key. And it's trying to find those opportunities that differentiate successful from not successful, however you want to define it, right?
That's right. Yeah. And for anybody like, yeah, I think one other thing on this particular topic, by the way, I think entrepreneurship is one of those fascinating words to me, because I don't know if this has been your experience, but I grew up speaking Eastern languages like Punjabi and Hindi and stuff like that, because that's the part of the world my parents are from. And so language is a very fascinating thing to me, because I don't think of the world as like 200 different countries. I think of it as maybe 5 different cultures divided by language. So English, Mandarin, Hindi, Spanish / Portuguese, and Arabic. And what's fascinating is that entrepreneurship is a noun here in English. In the Western world, entrepreneur is a noun, but most other languages don't have a direct word.
Yeah.
At least maybe recently they do. Like in Spanish and Portuguese, there are words more recently that are assigned for entrepreneur. But for the most part, the rest of the world still generally views entrepreneurship a verb. It's like, so in Punjabi, we don't say that person's an entrepreneur. The literal translation of what we say is that person is a hustler, like not negative connotation, but like that person is working hard, And I think that's like an important part here for people to understand, is that if you truly want to like build a practice, I think it is about mindset. It's about sort of starting off with this reality that like, it's not going to be simple, so it's not going to be easy, but it is simple. And it's really just about figuring out what's the one thing that has to go right every day, as opposed to the 37 ways something could go wrong.
Exactly.
And that's the difference.
Yeah, and then having realistic timeframes too, right? Like very, very seldom. I think I've treated 2 patients in the last couple of weeks. But it didn't happen overnight that way. Like when we were I was the OT. So when we brought on OT, like I was treating 40 hours a week for a while there. But people see like 20 years, they see the practice owner 20 years ahead of them, and they think, oh man, I'm failing because I'm 12 months in and I'm not there yet. And the reality is you just need to have realistic time frames.
I'm actually on that topic. I'm curious, like what do you think is a realistic time frame? Like if, is it a year? Is it 3 years?
I think 12 to 18 months is sufficient. Part of it is going to depend on, I hate being like one of those guys, it depends. You run it, and this is very basically what I did. I ran a break-even analysis and a pro forma, and I basically changed it to match our actual revenue per visit based on like our payer mix. And then it was just a numbers game. Like, how many patients do my clinicians need to see for me to earn what my benchmark salary is going to be, without treating at all, like with none of that money coming from me. And then it was just like, okay, this is the number of patients we need to see every day, and that's what we're going to shoot for. And it is that simple. It's not easy, but it's simple math, right?
Yeah. I don't think the My First Million guys would have ever thought they get talked about on a healthcare sort of podcast here. But, speaking of, I'm pretty sure Sean Puri said this, but speaking of that podcast, he meant, you talked about like building the pro forma or whatever. He talked about a very similar idea in a slightly different way. He said something at one point in a previous episode. He said something like, he started by working backwards by designing his perfect Tuesday. And in his world, he defined that as like, what do I want to do on a perfect Tuesday? And I think in many ways he said, I want to take a long shower. I want to be able to do X. I want to do Y. And he took that, I think, the way I interpreted that particular part of the podcast was like, he used that to then determine what the numbers on the pro forma had to say.
Yeah.
And then worked backwards on how to get there. So it wasn't like he just magically started off with a big pot of money and could take 4-hour showers, and so I think that's maybe a more accessible way for people to think about this is like, what's important to you. I remember when I heard that podcast years ago or whenever it was, I remember to me, like it was kind of a kick in the butt to say like, you know what, I'm going to spend every Wednesday afternoon at 4:00 to 6:00 with my daughter. She's my oldest. And I'm going to spend 4 to 6 every Friday with my boys, and then like building a date night, build this and all that. And then you use that to work backwards to what you want.
And going back to what we were talking about earlier, like those constraints mean that you're making business decisions throughout the week to make that happen, right? Like, I'm kind of similar, like Thursdays between the hours of like 1 and 5, like I'm basically inaccessible. I'm taking my kids to jujitsu. I'm doing something else. I'm hanging out with the wife. Like Fridays, I'm done at 1 type thing. But what that meant was that I look at my week and I say, okay, this time is just off the table, which means I need to get these 3 things or these 4 things done before Thursday or before Friday or before Tuesday, whenever those times are. And putting yourself in that situation where you have those constraints means that you're making decisions again that put you in a position to be successful there. Gosh, what's his name? He runs Strategic Coach, Dan Sullivan.
Oh,
yeah. He talks about like, if you want to double your income, you need to double the amount of time you take off. And like on the surface, you hear that and you're like, well, that's stupid because I need to work in order to make money. But that uncovers that belief, right? Like it doesn't need to be that way. And it really shouldn't be that way if the business is going to succeed without you. If you're really going to double the income at the business, you can't do it all. You're not going to do twice the amount of work and bring in that money.
I'm telling you, we're going to have like listeners being like, man, this is like a self-help podcast now. But just echoing this comment about mindset even more. I've known this guy, Ramit Sethi, for a long time, probably 15, almost 20 years now. We shared an old cubicle together like almost 20 years ago. And he wrote a book that's a New York Times bestseller now called I Will Teach You to Be Rich. But one of the concepts he talks about quite often is what you just sort of alluded to. He calls them the invisible scripts that each of us, as we were born and raised, particularly not when we were born, as we were raised as children and stuff like that, somehow implicitly we started building these invisible scripts. Like in examples he uses, he says like an invisible script can be that rich people are bad, or that spending money on ourselves is selfish, or that not working a full day is wrong. Like these are invisible scripts. And so he goes on to then explain that, his definition of a rich life is not rooted in the idea of like money. It's about sort of trying to fight these invisible scripts. And then, if you can recognize them, you can fight them. Like, for example, for me, even now, 20 years, 30 years into my career, I find like the little voice in my head saying, wait, we're doing a podcast. I should be working. When, and so like, or in my mind, it's like, I'll cut off at 4, but if I'm not careful about it, my brain's thinking like, oh, I don't know. Did I put in lazy? Am I being lazy?
Yeah.
But I like what, the guy you just mentioned said there is like, if you want to earn 2X, you got to, double your time off. I think there's a lesson in that. So anyway, I think it's super cool. We're going to get a bunch of self-help people coming down on us here, but we'll see.
The Strata Studios therapy hour.
That's right. Oh man, that actually would be kind of funny. We should do office hours and just talk about this. Actually, that should be our corporate April Fool's joke next year. Is that like April? Like April Fools, we're just going to start sending out invitations, $1,000 a seat at like the DoubleTree by each airport or something like that. So I love it. What else is going on in your world, man? Like your podcast is cranking, your business is cranking, separate story, you keep cranking out these kids. Like you seem to have like 36-hour days and the rest of us have 24-hour days. But what's like the big fun stuff going on in your world now?
Yeah, I think, well, obviously I'm spending a lot more time with the kids now. I think probably in the last 3-4 months, I've just decided I have not thought I'm going to double my income and take more time off, but I've played a constraint-based game with myself, and it was, okay, how much do I really need to be here for it? And here is like I'm on top of my clinic. It's underneath me. And then in this studio here, for it to, like, before the wheels start falling off, not that I'm trying to make the wheels fall off the bus or anything like that, but like, how much is really requiring me to be here? Because part of that is I want to like have like a hit list for 2025 of like, these are the systems or the processes that need to be put in place to make that even more irrelevant, right? And part of that is because I got a bunch of kids, and if I get hit by a bus or die by a lightning bolt strike or something like that, like, I think the biggest gift I could give my family, my wife, would be like, she doesn't need to do anything and the clinic's going to keep on cranking out money for her, as opposed to like, oh my gosh, Rafi's dead, I need to go, we're going morbid here, like I need to sell the business, all of that kind of stuff. So part of it was like some of that, like taking care of the family. And then the other part was like the whole reason, and I do believe this very, very firmly, the whole reason you go into business, to start a business, is so that you do not have to, and probably shouldn't, you do not have to be constrained by a job. And that's going to sound really lazy, but if you think about risk to reward ratio, like if the business revolves around you, like you need to be there, you need to treat the patients, you need to run payroll, you need to do everything. You've essentially taken a whole lot of risk, because we've talked about this before in the past. Like, you miss payroll and the IRS is coming after you, the lawyers are coming after you. It's a big deal. There are very few things you can get rid of, but you're taking on a lot of financial risk, right? If the business goes under, your employees are going to go find other jobs somewhere. Your teammates they're going to be fine, right? But you're the one that's going to be financially bankrupt and ruined, like worst case scenario. Yeah. So if that risk is not coupled with some kind of equal or greater benefit, then you should totally be out of the game of business ownership altogether. So for me, I'm thinking, I always like the consulting stuff. It's one-to-one. It scales basically on my time, and it is basically a job, but it's fun stuff that I like to do, fun projects that I like to do. So I don't really consider that like the business is going to provide for me. That's what the clinic and the clinical business is going to be. So that being said, over the last couple of months, I've really taken just a real hard look at what's going on and thought, okay, there are some things in the business that just require me to be here. And it's not because like it can't be done without me, but it's because I haven't delegated it, or I'm already here. So it's easier for me to just go ahead and do it. So I've been trying to pare back a little bit over the last couple of months, really with the goal of like by 2025, I'm still going to be here. I'm one of those people that probably going to die right here recording a podcast or something like that. I'm going to be doing something, but it won't necessarily be working in each business. It'll be more strategic in nature. So I've been doing that a good bit the last couple months.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Strata Stories. Strata PT is a single EMR platform and revenue cycle management service for physical, occupational, and speech therapy practices that helps you achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and RCM works, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo.